here to my coworker, Madison Flynn is the Assistant Director of NCIDC, and she's going to be helping with the chat box. And so when we get to it, we have door prizes, we have some books to give away, and Madison is going to, you can private message her in the chat room your address and if you're interested in a book. So we have two books here, one by Dr. Katja Risling-Baldi, and it's We Are Dancing for You. And we have a second book by Keishan, Dr. Keishan Lara Cooper, and it's Cam Tim. So both of these books are about teaching Indigenous resilience and healing and cultural practices. So if you're interested in that book, you can go ahead and write now in the chat box, private message Madison Flynn, and give your address and which book. So you can say Keishan's or Katja's, Keishan or Katja's. And we have 20 to give away. So the first 20 people to email or to private message in the chat box, Madison Flynn, will get this book, one or the other. So Katja or Keishan. All right, well, welcome everybody. It's so good to see all of you, 71 people. That's very impressive. Thank you for joining tonight. It shows how much we care about our children and our future generations. So I'm just gonna make a few announcements to begin with. If for some reason your internet is fluttering, then it's good if you turn your camera off because it will save bandwidth. So if you're having a hard time hearing any of the speakers, then please turn your camera off. And everyone, please be sure you're muted when you're not speaking. There will be time for questions. If you have questions while Sarah is presenting, if you could just write them in the chat box, we will pause periodically and take some of those questions. It is being recorded, but we haven't decided if we're going to publish it anywhere yet. But if you have issue with your name or your face being on this webinar for future use, it would be just for educational purposes, then please email me after the webinar. So, I introduce myself in my Dakota language. I am a learning speaker. I am still trying to learn my language. I'm a Honktawan Dakota from South Dakota, but I was born and I live here in Arcata, California. And I am the Indigenous Education Advocate for NCIDC and the ACLU of Northern California. And before I introduce the other speakers, I want to tell you a little bit about our organization and how this project came to be and how this webinar came to be. So NCIDC has been around for 44 years. They were established in 1976, and they're a nonprofit, and they provide help to Native American families in California, particularly in Northern California, Siskiyou, Humboldt, and Del Norte counties. They administer social and economic development programs. They have two key youth elements. One is the Daluk program, which is a Wiyot word that means to talk. And that's a new program at NCIDC as well for suicide prevention and for wellness. My position is also new at the NCIDC and ACLU. Part of the vision of NCIDC is to help foster future generations. So there's a concept called seventh generation thinking that a lot of Indigenous tribes, if not all Indigenous tribes, use as their worldview. And that just means that they think about the next generation, 7 generations ahead in terms of their well-being and what is the best decision to make for them. And children are sacred. And the reason we're here today is because we need these elements of hope during this time of apocalyptic fires and racism and violence and political uncertainty. And our children are suffering at this moment. And I think that we really need to embrace this moment to focus on healing of our own families, but also those of us that are advocates and teachers to be able to provide the best possible advocacy to ensure the mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being of our youth. So having said all that, I wanted to introduce the co-facilitator, and her name is Jen Mager, and she is going to introduce her program, First Five, and then introduce to our keynote, which is Sarah. Jen?
Thanks, Rain. And I am so pleased to see so many people and so many familiar faces. So that is exciting. As Rain mentioned, I am part of First Five Humboldt. And First Five Humboldt, it's a Humboldt commission of a larger statewide agency of First Five California. We educate, advocate, and invest in programs that strengthen families and that create supportive environments for children. It helps, the goal is to really tap into that inherent resilience and just help everyone reach the highest potential that they can. And we strongly believe that this happens in partnership. So this is a great example of partnering with NCIDC to be able to bring Sarah here and provide this information to our educators and community members. Part of our work, I'm the ACEs and Resilience Program Coordinator, is to offer these community and agency trainings through our ACEs Speakers Bureau. And the Speakers Bureau consists of local experts. It's great to both identify those who are here locally, but also who have a lot of knowledge. And so Sarah is somebody who brings a lot of information. And Sarah, I'm very grateful for you to come and give this presentation. I'll go ahead and introduce you. So today, Dr. Sarah Chase will be providing this presentation. She is an assistant professor in the Child Development Department at Humboldt State University. Sarah, I'll let you take it from here and just provide more information on yourself.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm actually going to transition into sharing my slides. Let's see, this always takes longer than it should. Okay, can everyone see this? Definitely encouraging using the little reactions, the clapping, the thumbs up, all of that. I might ask some questions along the way. So definitely feel free to use those. So I'll start with the title of my talk and then kind of go into more formal introduction. So the title of this kind of presentation is Indigenous Resilience in the Face of Colonial Trauma, Holistic Approaches to Supporting Indigenous Students. And so I want us to think, you know, you get kind of general frameworks around ACEs and general frameworks around resilience, but I want us to think very specifically about what Indigenous resilience means in the context of ongoing colonialism, and really, again, contextualizing that trauma not as this kind of isolated in individual children or families, but really as resulting from these historical legacies that very much impact kind of our present day. So, Sarah Chase, Heyangatin, Sadia Nohzan, Sarah Chase, Holiet, Natinu Auhtet, Shinnecock Auhtet. Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Chase. I'm happy to see all of you here, and I am both Hoopa, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, but I'm also Shinnecock, which is in Long Island, New York on my mother's side. So I'll introduce you a little bit. That was my introduction in the Hoopa language, which is a highly endangered language. Some of you are from Hoopa, know some Hoopa language, and so that's awesome to have you all here with me. And so I do this for a lot of reasons, but also that this is very much implicated in this legacy of colonialism. And so I think oftentimes in classes or in, even in kind of pop culture or whatever, you listen, you hear about colonialism in the past and you hear about it as this kind of distant thing. But really that's something that really impacts me personally in the way that I speak, in the fact that I am not a fluent speaker of the Hoopa language. That's a direct result of colonialism and ongoing colonial policies and practices. And so also in the face of that, having Indigenous resilience, having Hoopa people have that resilience to maintain our language, and so honoring that legacy as well. And so I am in my second year as an assistant professor at Humboldt State in the Child Development Department. But my longer kind of projects, both professionally and personally, have been with the Hoopa Valley Tribe, and more specifically recently with the Hoopa Tribal Education Association. And so I know there are some folks that have done work with them as well. But my work has continually been focused on the kind of resurgence of the Hoopa language, but really not just language, but kind of a resurgence of Hoopa lifeways, and passing those traditions on to Hoopa children. And so you can see that here. We're singing a Hoopa song and getting that kind of full body movement involved in that, and really, in a lot of ways, one of our most recent projects is to start to think about what our trauma-informed approaches from a Ngatinahwe, from a Hoopa perspective. What are things that are found in our language that, ways of relationships and treating one another that we can really look to. And so these newer frameworks around resilience and kind of fostering these supportive environments are really great and powerful and useful tools for our communities, but also what knowledge can we also bring in from our ancestors to do that healing work as well. Actually, so I am on the East Coast currently. And so I'm going to do a little bit of land acknowledgement being here. I'm at my mother-in-law's house right now in southeastern Connecticut. So I'm actually on the land of the Mashantucket Pequot people. And I have lots of relations here, some of them in this photo of the Youth Council, but also starting this presentation with an acknowledgement of where we all are. We're all very different places. Some of us are on our traditional homelands, others are not. Even though I am Indigenous, that means I'm a guest here on Pequot land at this point because I'm not Pequot. And so making those acknowledgements both of the kind of traditional caretakers of those lands, but also making a commitment to the people that are still here, right? That there are Pequot people still here, there are Hoopa people still here, that everywhere that you teach, there are Indigenous people still there, and that do continue to have those relationships with land. And so being very conscious of that, I know that that's not something that you are just automatically told when you're coming in as a new teacher to a school, but it should be, right? And so being very intentional, that's what I'm going to kind of ask you to reflect on throughout this presentation is, what does it mean to be, whose ancestral territory are you on? What does that mean? And whose ancestral territory do you teach on? Because those might be two different things, right? You might live somewhere else and teach somewhere else. I know a lot of folks who teach in Hoopa commute from the coast. And so what does it mean to commute from Wiyot land to Hoopa land? And what type of relationships and responsibilities do you have to those places and to those people? And also feel free at this point, if you do know, to throw those things in the chat box if you do know kind of whose ancestral territory you're on at this point. So this is a little bit of the agenda, just kind of going over some frameworks that'll be really important to understand. And the way that I'm thinking about this is, I think, newer than, like I said, these general frameworks around ACEs and around resilience. And so I'm bringing a lot of things together and I'm asking us to make these new connections. So it might seem a little disjointed, but I'm hoping to kind of bring those full circle back together at the end. And I'm thinking we'll probably do a break around 6:10. I don't believe in sitting in front of a computer for more than 2 hours straight if we don't have to do that. So definitely taking that break to do whatever we need to do in that time. And they'll also be kind of paced in little moments of reflection. It's going to be a lot of information. And so I want you to be able to take a moment to think about the things that are being presented, start to think about some questions around, okay, what does this mean? How can I start to implement this in my classroom? So we'll be putting you out in breakout rooms periodically as well, probably for about 5 minutes. And if there are things that you do want to share, again, feel free to put those in the chat box. And those moments of reflection can also be if you have comments or questions that you want to just turn on your audio and let me know. We can do that as well during those moments. So the first kind of piece of it, we'll be looking at just kind of a general framework for ACEs. What are ACEs? Why is it important to look at ACEs? What are the long-term impacts of ACEs? I think there's probably a broad range of people that have certain expertise or not in this. So it'll be, I'm sure, a lot of review for some of you and a lot of kind of introductory stuff and maybe brand new stuff to some others. So bear with me through the stuff that you may know already, but starting to think again about these connections might be new as well. So then we're going to move to contextualizing Indigenous ACEs. Why is it that ACEs are so prevalent in Indigenous communities? While at the same time, we can see these really rich histories and ongoing examples of Indigenous resilience. And so really framing that within Native studies, concepts of settler colonialism as well as survivance. And then at the end, hopefully we can turn that more into a conversation around strategies for working with Indigenous students and what does it mean to not just create these kind of supportive relationships for students, but to actively work against kind of power structures that are creating these barriers for Indigenous students to succeed in these classrooms. So first we'll start with what are ACEs, right? What are adverse childhood experiences? And we can look at these really in the micro level of the child as being in these different categories. We can look at different types of abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, and just issues that are happening in the immediate household, mental illness of a family member, having a family member being incarcerated. We can also start to think about high rates of these things in Indigenous communities, right? High rates of mental illness, high rates of violence against women, high rates of incarceration, high rates of substance abuse, high rates of kind of marital discord. And so at the micro level, we can really look at these really big events for children having these lasting impacts on children's health, mental and physical, for the rest of their lives. And the more ACEs you have, the kind of more high risk you are. So adverse childhood experiences coming from the first kind of studies published in the 90s. Vincent Felitti surveyed around 18,000 Kaiser Permanente patients and studied the long-term health and social impacts of ACEs over the lifespan and found significant long-term effects, including increased chronic disease that led to early death. So again, these long-term impacts, but we can also think about the limitations of looking at the specific demographic, right? These are all people that have health insurance, that have these resources. And so what does it mean to look at a broader population and kind of the causes behind where ACEs are more prevalent or not in certain communities? And so we can start to look at a much more expanded view outside of the kind of immediate micro level of the child of ACEs. And so you can look again at these kind of same different types of abuse homelessness, divorce, incarceration, all of those things. But really at the root of those problems, you know, what kind of causes someone to go to substance abuse, what causes these high rates of domestic violence, what causes families to have to be homeless, you can see these social issues that happen in lots of communities at the root of that, right? Poverty, discrimination, community disruption, lack of opportunity, economic mobility and social capital, poor housing, quality and affordability, so not a lot of access to housing, and violence. And we can also know in our current moment, right, of being in this global pandemic, resurgence of white supremacy and economic downturn, all of these things are exacerbated and really happening at higher rates across the nation. And so this is another graphic just kind of looking at those different, you know, different ways that ACEs can happen and what are the different causes of that. So again, the household, looking at things that happen in the community. And so then we can also start to think about historical trauma and structural racism. And then also thinking about the environment. Fires is obviously a huge one that we want to think about right now. How can we expect children to learn in classrooms if they can barely breathe? If you know, they lost their home, if they're homeless as a result of these crises that are happening. And we can also think of ACEs both as in terms of time. So it can be something that happens over a prolonged amount of time, or it can be something that's just very, very huge and dramatic in the moment. So something like losing your home, right? That does have these long-term effects, but it was this kind of initial experience that led to that ACE. And so they build off one another as well. So ACEs have a huge impact on health and well-being. As I mentioned before, as the number of ACEs increase, so does the risk for negative health outcomes. So you can see, again, you can have 0 to 4+ ACEs being at really high risk for negative health outcomes, as well as being at risk for these kind of high-risk behaviors, being lack of physical activity, smoking, alcoholism, drug use, missing work. And so why are these things happening? And then again, these long-term health effects, severe obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, STDs, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, broken bones, the list kind of goes on of, as we know, these things are related, right? If you're obese, then you're more likely to have diabetes and heart disease. All of these things also kind of build off one another. So just looking 4 or more ACEs, what are the increased risks that come with having that number of adverse childhood experiences? Individuals that experience 4 or more ACEs prior to age 18 are more likely to 10 times more likely to use prescription drugs, 7 times more likely to be an alcoholic, suffer from depression or anxiety, to smoke, to attempt suicide, 12 times more likely, 2.4 times more likely to have a stroke, 1.9 times more likely to have cancer, 1.6. So you can see these numbers really increase exponentially when you have this high number of ACEs. And lots of things can both contribute to ACEs as well as contribute to kind of protective factors or resilience building in the face of ACEs, genetics, environment, and also, and this is what we're really going to focus on, relationships with primary caregivers and community can have that huge impact on life results as a result of these ACEs. And so I have a couple of videos that I'm going to show along the way. I am a professor, but definitely not an expert in everything. And so I like to rely a lot on bringing others in. So you'll see a lot of videos kind of sprinkled throughout. I'm hoping we can hear everything. I'm gonna probably ask Rain or Jen to let me know if there's any issues with the technical stuff. But this is just a short video to look at the way that the brain is literally built by experiences. And so the impact that these experiences, both negative and positive, can have on our brains. Is that okay? Of course.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Of course, I lost my slide. Okay, let's try it again.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
Excellent. Can I ask Rachel Bass to mute herself? Thank you.
There's always problems when you show videos and you try to go back and forth between your PowerPoint. Okay, here we go. So all of that was to just say, right, that both our connections and those connections that are pruned are based on either experiences we have or we don't have. And so the architecture, the very architecture of our brain is a result of the experiences that we have in our lives. And that early on in these critical, and I'll talk about this in a second, in these critical periods of development for children, those can have really lasting impacts on the child for the rest of their lives. So maybe we'll take this moment to go to any questions or comments. I think you were looking at the chat box. Rain, was there anything?
I am looking now, and I may have missed any. It looks like people are reporting on where they live. While I go through these, maybe if someone wants to go ahead and ask a question now before we try our breakout rooms.
Yeah, any initial comments or questions? Don't feel like you have to have any, but you had any along the way. Is that Kim?
So in looking at the video and just looking at what, and listening to what you've said so far, I'm curious, are we going to be talking this evening about developing resilience regarding these things as well? I'm just in a plan to get there. Yes, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, so you kind of just have to bear with me in understanding these things first, right? And understanding both the biological aspects and the social emotional aspects. And then it's going to get even heavier, honestly, through colonialism stuff. But just giving the fact that most people don't know this information, or kind of maybe knew it once, but don't know it really well and have that working knowledge and understanding and being able to use that in their classrooms, then we'll kind of get to that other end of, okay, what does this all mean? How do we counter these things? But we gotta get through all that first.
I can appreciate that. Thank you so much, Sarah. You're doing great.
I have a quick question with regard to, and maybe this is kind of like fast forward kind of question, but how, I feel like this is really important information to share with students. And is there a curriculum or is there a plan to kind of roll out trauma-informed practices so that students are aware of maybe the behaviors that they see in their families or the behaviors that they're exhibiting, and understand, like, so that they have I think it's important for like self-regulation work. Like, how do I learn to self-regulate if I don't know why this is happening to me? Is there work in that area?
I agree with you 100%. I think that across different communities, there probably is work being done, but there's always more work to do. And so I definitely think that that is a direction that we should probably move in Hoopa, especially with older kids, and having them understand, like you said, this is why I'm feeling this way, this is why I'm acting this way, and this is the broader understanding of, why my family does these things or whatever. And for me too, I have done work not specifically around ACEs and kind of trauma informed, but the more like understanding colonialism and the impacts of kind of historical trauma on our community with youth, I think I did 8th to 12th grade, having these conversations, and it was really impactful. And it's something that I want to do more long-term. The reason I didn't keep doing it is because I literally just didn't live in the area, but now that I do again, that's definitely something that I would like to kind of continue to do more long-term and bring in these pieces, because I really do think it would make a huge impact. So thanks for that.
Well, and I'm wondering that this community of people who find this very relevant information as from an educator perspective, I feel like if this was a curriculum that schools would adopt, then for those people who aren't joining in on a 5 o'clock, training, on a Wednesday night, they can learn with their students about trauma-informed practices and why ACEs is important and how this explains, because, there's not really a way to force this type of PD on educators outside of like, hey, we have a new curriculum, this is what we're doing. And then it kind of forces that conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Any other questions? Did you see anything, Rain?
No, there has not been any questions yet.
Okay, so we will move to our first breakout rooms. And so we'll be doing these kind of periodic think, pair, and shares. And just kind of trying to bring this home, right? Thinking about your personal experiences. So this is the question, and I can also send this, I can broadcast in the rooms once you're in there. Can you think of a way you respond to an experience that was shaped from your childhood experiences, which may be different than the way another person may respond? So thinking both of yourself and your kind of personal experiences and your reactions then in relation to that, and stepping outside of yourself to say, okay, maybe somebody else had this other experience. How did they respond and why? So now we'll do the rooms, and then I can send this. So once you're in the breakout room, so basically you'll get an invitation that says, I'm joining this breakout room. And then once you're in there at the top, there'll be a screen that'll have the questions, so you can look at that when you're in there too. I might have to stop sharing first. Okay, so we have an odd amount of people, so it'll be 2 or 3 people. And here we go.
Can you type in the chat box the question also?
I don't think they can see the chat box once they're in there, though. That's the problem.
Maybe in that message to all.
Yeah, I can do that.
Sarah, did you put 2 or 3 people in the rooms?
I did 2 to 3.
Okay.
So it'll, because there's an odd amount of people.
I'm wondering if we may need to join so we don't leave someone solo.
Oh, true. I can monitor it and see if there's anybody.
So I'm being sent to breakout room 5. Is there 1 or 2 people there?
1 second. Oh, it's too, my question is too long. Okay, 5 is Breck also.
Oh, cool. Okay, I'm out.
So, I mean, I think you have to go because Breck's not going to go.
Oh, is there 1 other person there?
Yeah. Is anyone having trouble joining a room?
I was by myself in a breakout room, so I just left it. Should I wait to be placed into a different one?
I think if you go back in, somebody should be there. It says somebody's there now. Try it and then come back.
Okay. I don't have a prompt to go again because I left it. Sorry. Well, I found it.
Is anyone else having trouble going to their breakout room?
Yeah, well, nobody showed up to mine, so I thought I'd just come back.
Okay, I think I tried to move you. Let me move people around.
Thank you.
Do you know what room you were in, Nancy?
Room 34.
Oh, weird. Okay, I'm not finding you, so we can just talk here if you want. Did you have any response?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and it's such a like a broad question. I don't even know which how to answer it because I could think of so many different things. But I think I'll go with just taking things personally because I think I'm always so impressed when people are able to not do that. So yeah, I think that's definitely something I got from like early childhood experiences where I didn't really learn how to speak up for myself, or like I just took things on. And now as an adult, it's like something that I still struggle with and have to kind of overcome and remind myself about. So yeah, I'm curious to hear what everyone else has to say.
Does anyone else want to share in our little group here? We have Sarah and 2 Heathers. I can share. So my mom is always late and has always been late. And so every time, like when I was younger and I was like going to like a friend's house or like anything, we would always be late. And so I definitely still have like really bad anxiety around being late and like, why am I late? Even though now as an adult, I can control it a lot more. I have this like adverse reaction to like, can't be late. I have this control, but I'm still late and kind of replicating those things. So that's my thought around that. And I think it's definitely something that, you know, has happened my entire life. So probably from my first memory of like being in preschool, that stuck with me. Can you pinpoint yours to a certain age of when you think that started, Nancy?
Oh, that's a no, not really, because my whole entire childhood is kind of just blurred. I don't remember a whole lot, so I think it's just always been a thing for as long as I can remember anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're gonna try to bring people back. That was harder than I wanted it to be, but we'll see how it went. How'd that go? Anyone want to share any cool things you came up with?
I can talk about, for me, it wasn't, I couldn't really specify exactly like one given um, instance or example of like, you know, a situation that would happen. I just know from my own personal, you know, from my own experience growing up and stuff like that, the way I would tackle a situation is going to be different than anyone else because of my background, my own personal backgrounds. You know, whether that's race, you know, religion, you know, area where I grew up, you know, and stuff like that. So it's like all of that plays into a factor into how I handle every situation. And, you know, no 2 people going through the same thing are going to respond the same way just because the way that they have internalized and understood situation is going to be different, you know, than myself. So it's one of those things that it's always going to be slightly different from everyone.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing. And I think that brings up an important point too of, you know, we all are these individual people who've had these individual childhoods and experiences that have kind of led to who we are. While at the same time, most general approaches to education are very, all children should be doing this thing and all children need to learn this in this way. And so that's another way that we need to kind of question that system of, you know, actually everyone is an individual learning styles, comes in with these individual experiences. And so how can then we be flexible and adapt to each of the students instead of just trying to force them to do these things and then punishing them when they don't do them, even though that's a really unrealistic expectation for them. So thanks for sharing that. Any questions before we move on? I'm gonna bring us back into our slides. And if it was, I know it was a little chaotic trying to make sure everyone was in a room with someone else. So hopefully this next time around, it'll be a little easier. Okay. So we can also see this, that neurons are the building blocks to kind of who we are as people, and the building blocks to what our brain will be like. And so as we saw in the video, what isn't used gets pruned away, and what's repeatedly used, connections become reinforced and more efficient. And so to understand why we see the lifelong effects that we do, we have to know how the neurons work. And you can see in these really, really critical periods, even before birth, the way that, you know, the neurons are really spread apart, they're really thin, there's not a lot of connections, but over time, the more experiences that the child has, the more, you know, even, you know, listening to language or whatever experiences that they're having in the world, those connections are forming and becoming thicker, and more lasting over time, where as you then move into kind of early childhood to middle childhood, then our brains start to become more specialized in, this is who we are, this is the language that we speak, this is the way that we understand the world, this is the way that, you know, we think certain things are right or wrong. Those things are starting to solidify a lot more. And so in these really early years of infancy, you're just making all the connections possible, right? That children are really babies are really absorbing everything that comes their way. Where this transition into early childhood, you start to really specialize in, okay, this is the language that I speak. These are the things that, you know, this is how I live my life. These are my relationships. This is what I do in response to stresses, things like that, really start to form and stay lasting to a certain extent in this early childhood to middle childhood stage. So then we can talk about really the importance of looking specifically at childhood, and we can look at these sensitive periods of brain development. And so it's really important also to highlight that it's not kind of an end all be all. If a child's not doing this by this time, you know, they're kind of a lost cause, but really just more broadly looking at patterns, and, you know, patterns that can guide us into knowing, okay, at this point, we really need to focus on kind of emotional regulation or language, or peer social skills, things like that. So for better or worse, early experiences impact brain development, the formation of language, emotional regulation, and stress responses are most vulnerable before age 3. So again, it's really important to then expose children to language, these emotional regulation strategies, and really positive ways to dealing with stress very early on, because then, as I said, you know, those things start to solidify in this is the language I'm going to speak, this is what I do in certain situations. Those really start to solidify as you get into the early childhood years. So you can see the different kind of periods here. And you can see a lot of them, you know, are kind of out of, you know, as K-12 educators, a lot of this work has already kind of been done. That doesn't mean that we can't help support that growth. And so we can see that school years also have a major impact on those sensitive periods and brain development. I think I'm gonna skip this video, but we can, again, just think about how stress and development shape arousal responses. Actually, I don't think it's too long. Let's show it. But I might have to do, YouTube for this. Might need help with this tech stuff.
What are you trying to do, Sarah?
Trying to go into, I think if I get out of screen share, that'll help me, to YouTube. I didn't embed this. Okay, I think I got it.
One of the most rewarding experiences for me.
And then you're sharing your screen again, right?
All right.
One of the most rewarding experiences for me has been to study brain science and apply it to the experience of parenting. And the hand model of the brain that I use to teach parents is very useful to understand that. So if you take your thumb and put it in the middle of your palm, put your fingers over the top, this is a very useful model of the brain. And when we can actually see in front of us what's going on in the brain, then we can change what the brain does. So let me walk you through very basically what happens in this brain and the structures in it. And it goes like this. The spinal cord comes up representing the wrist, and then you have coming up into the skull the brain stem and the limbic area, which work together to help regulate arousal and your emotions and the way you have a fight, flight, freeze response. These are below the cortex, the limbic and brainstem areas, and the cortex is this higher part of the brain that allows us to perceive the outside world, to think and reason. And this frontmost part of the brain, right behind your forehead, so the person's oriented like this, is actually the part that regulates the subcortical, limbic, and brainstem areas. This regulation is very important because sometimes we can have all sorts of things happen in our life. We're tired, we're exhausted, someone pushes a particular emotional button, and we can flip our lids. So rather than being tuned in and connected and balanced and flexible, we can lose all of that flexibility, even lose moral reasoning, and act in ways that are terrifying to others, including our children. Now, you can actually bring yourself back online and come back to the high road and make a repair with your child, and that's important to explain to them. And you can also use this hand model of the brain to explain to children, even as young as 5 and 6, how to understand when their emotions are rising up from the brainstem and limbic areas here, and how it's overriding the prefrontal area and making it so they may be about to flip their lids. So I've had kids come tell me that they're about to go flip their lids and they need a break. They need a timeout. And by even just naming that, they can tame it. And that's the power of using the hand model for ourselves and our children to help us all make sense of what goes on in the emotional communication that we have in the course of day-to-day life.
Good grammar and
So that's really useful, right? And thinking about how do you explain this to a child? As you know, we had that question of, it's great that we all as adults kind of know this, and as educators we can talk about this, and there's only going to be some of us that are interested in it, but how can you actually start to talk to children about this? And so that's a great example of what you can do, and make those connections to yourself, as well as, you know, sometimes even I, you know, want to flip my lid, and so these are the things that I do to make sure that I don't. And then we can talk about toxic stress. And I think this is probably the last video that I'm going to show, because I want us to kind of move to the next section. And thinking about, you know, we all deal with kind of stressful events in our lives, but what kind of moves it to toxic stress, and what are the lasting impacts that can have?
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So when you have those adverse childhood experiences, even though it might be something that happened, once, again, if you don't have these positive relationships with adults and that attentive response, then that's something that can build in their bodies over time. And if we think about the impact of those important kind of critical periods of brain development, that can really have serious impacts on their ability to speak or kind of emotional regulation or kind of social emotional interactions that will have these lasting effects over time. And we can also look at the way that arousal can mean certain things. So sometimes the brain becomes wired to hyperarousal, fight or flight. And so if you have this constant fight or flight, right, that's something that's, there's always this danger happening, then you want to rest, you want to be vigilant, you want to be resistant. You might, children might cry, they might have tantrums and then lead to aggression. Sometimes the brain becomes, so again, there are these individual responses. Not everyone is going to respond to things in the same way. Sometimes the brain becomes wired to disassociate, to freeze, to completely kind of check out, to avoid things, to be detached. Things like fetal rocking are signs of disassociation as well. And then kind of typical non-trauma impacted brains have these states of calm, arousal, alarm, fear, and terror, but don't have them for the same like extended amount of time, and have the kind of heightened reactions. So we can do another pair and share if you all are good with that. And then maybe we'll take a little break after we get back from that. And we can check in on some questions too. Were there any questions in the chat?
No, just comments so far, unless I missed anyone. Anyone have a question now they wanted to ask? If you don't mind, Sarah, I just wanted to share something real quick.
We had a question.
Okay, go
Sorry,
ahead.
I'm a late check-in.
Go ahead. Ask your question, Sherry.
I was wondering, so when you guys are talking about like kids that are like when they're in fight or flight mode like for a long period of time, like what happens to the brain when it continues for like years? like without like you're really like, you know, like my mom was like, you know, abused when I was little, you know, and like for a long time I was afraid. And so like now I have a lot of anger issues, but is there like a I don't know, scientific thing about like, you know, your brain, like I don't know how to explain it, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to depend on the specific situation. So I can't give you a blanket answer of this what happened, but it definitely impacts the connections, right? I don't know at what point you came in, but we had those videos and thinking about what connections are maintained and strengthened through repeated either positive or negative impacts, and which ones are pruned. And so I wish I would have had this slide in there, but there's a slide of kind of a child's brain, kind of a typically.
But you said aggression was something that happens like right. That's what is the outcome is like.
It can be, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, sorry I came in late, but I'm not paired with anybody. We have a share and paired. I don't know how you guys did that.
I'm going to throw you in groups in a second.
Okay. Oh, all right. Thank you.
Yep.
I just wanted to share that Dr. Yellowbird, who used to teach at HSU, he talked about how ceremonies or meditation, seeing your sacred objects like your jump dance baskets or your regalia, it does something to your brain where it starts creating the good feelings, and that's healing. So even though the neurons are broken from the trauma, the healing process through ceremonies and praying, it reconnects them. So it's not all lost. Like you can develop your brain by meditation, prayer, ceremonies to heal. I thought that was a really good piece of wisdom. And the other thing that somebody taught me, I don't remember which elder, was that the trauma that's passed on through, it gets encoded into your DNA. The other positive side of that is that intergenerational ancestral knowledge is the sound of music or the body with the drum makes that connection. So you also get the good stuff passed through your DNA. So that ancestral memory of when you hear a song or you hear a brush dance song or something, that will like trigger the good memories that you have from your DNA, from your ancestors. So I just wanted to share that.
I would like to make a comment on that, Rain. Thank you. My grandfather is a Native American, and he was born in 1906. He's since passed, but he went through a lot of trauma in his younger years. And yes, it is passed along in the DNA. We know now scientifically that it's passed, but we can change that up through teaching people how to rewire their brain, just like these videos are showing. Meditation is the #1 way of doing it, and breathing. Breathing makes all the difference in the world, but positive thought and gratitude and teaching people how to look at the positive side, glass is half full, not half empty, and having them remember their happy memories really sparks those neurons in our brain to develop a better they connect better. In fact, positive thought makes the brain function faster than negative thought. So even though there's fight and flight in most of people that suffer trauma, if they can remember a happy memory or have a happy experience or have somebody say something kind to them, then all of a sudden it triggers the dopamine levels take off, and it's just fantastic. So yeah, Bruce Perry, I saw you use the Bruce Perry post. He's an amazing brain surgeon and yeah, brain development. So thank you for bringing that up, Rain.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Okay, I think we're going to go into our rooms. So your question is, can you think of a time where someone you know or your own stress response went from calm to terror rapidly? Can you recall all the details of that moment? So just thinking about how impactful stressful moments can be. And it doesn't have to be a super traumatic thing. It can be if that's something that you want to bring up, but it can also just be something, you know, a super stressful moment, you know, test or something like that too, that did trigger these kind of ingrained memories. So I'll throw the question in the chat, and then I will put it when I send you in your group.
How long will we have, just so we know like how much or how little to share?
Yeah. Does 5 minutes sound like not enough, or does that sound all right?
If there's 3 people, could we have 6 minutes?
We could do 6 minutes anyways. Yeah, let's do 6 minutes. So I'm sending that, and I will put you in your rooms. Let me know if you're having trouble joining a room. I'm having to move people around to make sure. Okay, I think we should be good. Anyone on here having trouble?
How do I go into a different room?
Did you get the invitation before to join a room?
Are you asking me or somebody else?
I think I'm asking Sherry.
Yeah, sorry. No, I got the email, but I don't think that's what you're talking about. I came in like 30 minutes late, so I don't know if you guys had already done the room, but no, I didn't get no invitation to another room.
Okay, it should just pop up on your screen. Let me see if we can find you. And if not, okay, so we have Sarah and Sherry and Nancy. Kristen. You can use this as a room too.
Oh, okay.
If folks want to share.
It's a big day? No way. Is there money in there?
Does anyone want to share, thinking of a time, and if you can recall the details?
I can share. I'm thinking of the time when I was outside with my sisters and a really big bumblebee kind of came in, and one of my older sisters just like automatically freaked out and started screaming and running all over the place. And then I want to say maybe like 30 seconds later, she realized that the bee wasn't around anymore, and we kind of all just started laughing. But yeah, that's what came up for me.
Nice. Anyone else want to share? Sorry, I'm having to move people around. Sherry, did you want to share anything? I think we'll do maybe one more minute. So do you feel like, Nancy, do you feel like you could remember all of those details because it was such a stressful thing?
Well, I guess it was for her, but for me, it was just like a really funny moment that I remember. Because she did like one of those really deep screams. And that's how I knew she was like extremely terrified. But yeah, I think it's one of those moments that definitely has always stuck. So did that answer your question? Sorry.
Yeah. And I mean, do you think if you asked her about it, like, what do you think her response? Do you think that she would also recall it and like, oh yeah, I remember that?
Well, that's a tough one because I think her memory is worse than mine. So she might remember, but yeah. There was also a time where she got chased by a cow and was running around the whole like entire house outdoors. But yeah, and she ended up, she'd probably be really mad if I told, but she ended up peeing her pants by the end of it. She'd probably remember that.
Probably. All right, I think I'm gonna let people back in. Okay, looks like most people are back. How's everyone doing? Do you feel like we need a little break?
Okay. I'm good. I'm glad to be here.
Okay. Awesome. So maybe we'll go for about 15 more minutes and then we'll do a break because I might need to get up and stretch a little bit. So let's go back in and I'm gonna just kind of considering time, I'm gonna move forward and start to transition to our next section and start from here.
Did you say we were taking a break? I came late.
No, not yet. I think everyone wants to go a little longer, so we can go maybe 10, 15 minutes. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. So just looking at how our early experiences shape our responses later on. And so you can kind of see this straight line for quote unquote normal development, not having these significant ACEs, and those having being more vulnerable, having more extreme reactions and extreme baselines. While on the other side, and this is where we can start to think of, okay, fine, we understand that trauma does all these things to us, but how do we also start to build resilience? And how can we kind of combat those things? And so you can also see that being resilient can lead you back to a more healthy baseline, and creating those supportive environments around that child and that person can lead to that resilience for them. And so I'm going to bring us back to this slide and thinking about expanding our view of ACEs specifically for Indigenous students and families. Again, that we have these kind of micro level things happening in their homes and in kind of their direct experiences. But the underlying issues are these more bigger and harder to combat social issues. And even more than that, I want us to think of the soil, right? And so if we think of this kind of metaphor of the tree as adverse childhood experiences kind of stem from these things at the micro level, but the roots of those issues at the micro level are these broader social issues. I actually want to ask the question, okay, we know that poverty and discrimination, violence in our communities, lack of opportunity and capital lead to these micro level adverse childhood experiences in homes, but what's even below that? And so I want us to look even deeper than that at something called settler colonialism that is both specific to Indigenous students, but really something that we're all living under and being affected by. So we're gonna kind of zoom out a little more now. And maybe we won't do a pair and share for this, but we can either throw some things in the chat or open it up a little bit to think about what do you know about settler colonialism, and have you ever heard this term before? I'm sure some of you have. So if you want to throw some things in the chat or just kind of unmute yourself. And we could even give like a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you've heard that before.
Lola would like an explanation, definition of settler colonialism.
We'll get there.
Sounds good.
I think that's
well,
what it is.
Colonists just came from our east and decided that the land was free for all, and no matter what kind of adversity they came against, they decided, hey, I'm going to hang out here. And as settlers settled, and there started to be some adversity, I suppose you could say. The colonists, they were like, well, I'm gonna stay here. I came from, basically they were illegal immigrants and they came and took over the area and fought their battles to keep power over their land so that they could stay there.
Awesome. So it seems like there's a lot of people that actually haven't heard it, maybe have heard the colonialism part and not the settler part, have some narratives of understandings around what does this mean. And so now we're going to get more into the definitions, but I also just wanted to highlight the fact that a lot of people don't know this information, haven't been taught it, and that's on purpose, because part of the settler colonial project is to kind of erase and normalize the power and the existence, the continued existence of that power structure. You don't know about it for a reason, and it's not something that's being taught and kind of talked about in classrooms for a reason. So this moves to the next section, settler colonialism, native sovereignty, and survivance. So I'm going to talk about those terms as we go along. So what is settler colonialism? This is a term that Native people have used much longer than this, but was kind of coined by Patrick Wolfe, who has passed away, but was an Australian historian. And he defined settler colonialism as something in which settler colonizers come to stay. Invasion is a structure, not an event. And so we had our explanation just now of, people literally coming here and saying, actually, this is my home now, right? Even though there already were, millions of Indigenous people here, caretaking land, had their own languages, governance systems, all of those things. You have these settler colonizers coming in and saying, actually, no, this is my home now, and I'm going to destroy everything and replace it with what I want. And so settler colonialism operates with a logic of elimination of the native, and that means a lot of different things over time. But what's, I think, probably different even than definitions of colonialism that some of you have probably heard before, that really relegate it to the past, right? You probably have like a pre-contact unit and then like a contact unit and maybe a few sentences in your textbooks about colonialism as something in the past, but this definition really wants us to think of it not as an event in the past, not as a specific massacre or treaty or boarding schools, but really the connections between all of those that are structured into our very society today. And so we want to, again, think of this in the present and making those connections to the past, but that it's something that's ongoing. And it's a specific type of colonialism too, right? Because there are lots of other types of colonialism. So you can think of kind of something like India, where they just wanted to extract goods, or think places in Africa, right, where they just wanted to extract goods and labor, but didn't actually want to set up and stay and make this place their new home. So that's the difference and important distinction that we want to make in thinking about the specific type of colonialism that happens here. And so it's this broad thing that attacks all areas of life, really. And so we can also think about the connections between settler colonialism and capitalism, and the way that resources are distributed or not, who's rich, who's poor, who's not, why does this happen? There aren't a ton of indigenous billionaires, right? That's not something that's by accident. White supremacy is also very much interrelated with settler colonialism. And thinking about race and anti-Indigenous racism, anti-immigrant sentiments, xenophobia, anti-Blackness, thinking about also these regimes of gender violence, cis heteropatriarchy, in enforcing that strict gender binary. There were lots of Indigenous tribes that had many more genders than just kind of this male female that was then placed on us as a result of settler colonialism, as well as different types of expressing sexuality and ableism, and treating people differently based on their abilities. Settler colonialism also very much privileges able-bodied people and then sees disabled people as inferior. So it really impacts all areas of our lives, which then we want to think about that more localized in how do these things play out in children and families, in schools and in classrooms. So where are examples of settler colonialism? It's happening all over the world, here in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in South Africa, and New Zealand. We can also think of Palestine as a newer settler colonial state, again, where these colonizers come to stay and make this new place their home and destroy everything that kind of gets in their way. And so tracing specifically American settler colonialism, since the first arrival of settlers, America has experienced settler colonialism. And so we had a comment of saying it happened from the East. And we have multiple colonialisms happening in the beginning too, right? You do have people coming from the East, and then you also have the Spanish kind of coming up at the same time. But then we have these changing over of regimes, ultimately having what we now know as the United States. And so if this is kind of a historical material reality that we're living under, we want to highlight that violence and highlight the ways that those things are structured into our society. But we also want to highlight simultaneously that if settler colonialism operates with this logic of eliminating Indigenous peoples have been fighting against settler colonialism. And so that's what makes it possible, right, for me to be even giving this presentation, for a lot of you to be sitting there in this audience, that the settler colonial project and that logic of elimination has not been fulfilled. And so that's something that we're continually fighting against, and our very existence here as Indigenous people today is a testament to those acts of resilience of our ancestors. And so you have this logic of elimination and then this pushback from Native people to really just stay alive in as many ways as possible. And so this combination of these two factors have kind of brought us to where we are now, and moving forward, we can trace these things as well. So I do want to do this parent share, and then maybe we will take a break now after the parent share happens. In what ways do you teach about Indigenous peoples in your classrooms? And I want you to be honest about this. You don't teach about Indigenous peoples. Maybe you teach science, and so you think, oh, well, you know, it's not really relevant. It actually is 100% relevant, I promise you. And so thinking about how do you teach about Indigenous peoples, if you do at all, and in what ways do you teach not only about this general broad category of Indigenous peoples, but about the specific Indigenous peoples of the area where you are. So I'll do the same thing, put you in your groups, put it in the chat. Are there any questions along the way? There looks like there's a lot of comments. Anything you saw, Rain?
No, just comments. Lillian did ask, does it also displace the people and call it their own land of discovery regarding settler, focusing on the settler part of colonialism?
Yeah, for sure. And so, right, like the fact that it's called the United States, of pushing people off their land and then renaming is a big part of that as well. There's a reason that it's not called Turtle Island. There's a reason that all the places that we live are not necessarily called their traditional names in Indigenous languages. So that's definitely a part of it. Okay, let me send this in the chat and then put you in your groups. Anyone else need help with anything?
The same thing just keeps happening to me where I'm the only one in the group. So I don't know what that is about, but.
Okay, let me get some things. Hold on, I'll be right back.
By the way, I asked my sister if she remembered about the bee, and she did not, but she remembered about the cow. Sarah, it looked like you were talking. I'm not sure if you were talking to us or but you. Okay.
Okay. That's my fault. But I'll bring folks back now. And then I think we're going to take a break. As you all come back in, anyone want to share?
Sure, I'll go. Well, I grew up in Alaska for 5 years and I was in second grade. And in my family, we didn't talk about being Indians in the 70s and the 80s. So growing up in Alaska, I remember like you're going to Indian education and we didn't do any Native history or anything. And so I'm pulled into this Indian ed tutoring program, and I'm looking at all these other Indians and I'm confused about who I am compared to, because I didn't look like them. So it was very like, what's going on? And I always thought as a kid from watching TV that I was a Western Plains Indian. I didn't know I had Yurok blood in me and that my family lived in houses. You know, it's like, so no, I mean, today it's a lot better, but back for me, I was like, I don't even know what's going on. I was like,
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And that's by design, right? But a lot of folks never got to hear or see themselves reflected in anything. So to not know it was not their fault, it's just, you know, the way that things are structured.
mm-hmm.
Any other comments or questions?
Coda, don't throw the bear, please. Oh, sorry.
It's okay. Okay, if not, then I think we'll maybe take a 10-minute break. We'll meet back at 6:47. Okay, so I'm just gonna turn my stuff off and then come back at 9:47.
Sounds good. See you all.
Thank you, Sarah.
All right, hopefully everyone had a good break. Time to get up and stretch a little bit. And we will jump back in. So, always talking about this balance, right, of the violence and the trauma that's happened, but also the resistance and the resilience and survivance, which I'm going to give you a definition for in a bit. Native people today continue to face and resist the structures of settler colonialism. And there are lots of examples of this: racist governments, oil companies. We can think of kind of outside control of resources. Water is something that's really important to local tribes. Anti-Indigenous racism and assimilationist curriculum that continues to take place in schools. So I'm going to go through a pretty brief history of some of the policy changes and some of those key moments of the different changing eras of settler colonialism. And so seeing how that logic changes over time, but still remains. And so taking of land, right, this targeted elimination of native land is something that is really central to the settler colonial project. And so we can think of that in terms of removals and then reservations, really cutting out these small pieces of what were our traditional homelands and saying you can only stay on, you know, these territories. You only have sovereignty over these small pieces of what used to be our traditional homelands. And so thinking of this in terms of policy, we can point to around the 1830s, but even before that, if you think to the East Coast, this is happening in the 1600s, as well as kind of coming up from Spain and Southern tribes happening as far back as kind of the 15 and 1600s as well. And then that kind of wasn't enough, right? The removals westward and putting people on reservations wasn't enough. They needed more land. And so they said, well, actually, you don't get to have these kind of collective relationships to land and to people anymore. You're each going to get this tiny piece of land, something called allotment. And we're only going to give you a certain amount, and whatever is left over, because there's going to be some that's left over, given the way that we're kind of parceling this out, is then going to go to settlers. And so all of these strategic ways of taking land from Native people, and then up into the 50s, then you have these policies of encouraging Indigenous people to then leave the reservation and assimilate into the city, promising them jobs and all of these great things, and then really just dumping them in the city with no resources or any kind of connections. But through all of this, you know, the fact that we even have reservations, those of us that do, the fact that we're gaining land back, right? We can think about the land that was given back to the Wiyot recently, not being a gift, but as something that was really hard fought by Indigenous people. The fact that we do still have our collective relationships to land, and that even in urban centers where some folks were promised or forced to go, we have these really vibrant Indigenous communities in these urban centers now as well. And so I like to do a little bit of a visual. I'm not sure if you've all seen this map. Can you see it?
I cannot see it.
Not yet.
No.
Now?
I think you're not sharing your screen yet.
Okay.
None of the things you've said since the break have been on. There we go.
Oh, okay. Here we go. So you can see, and again, this happening, right? They don't really count the 13 colonies in this. This is where my mom's tribe is. It's where I am right now, being taken even before 1776. But you can see how rapidly that Indigenous land is stolen from Native peoples, and you can kind of see what we're left with, and you can really see, visualize the way that settler colonialism works through these different policy and these practices that are, you know, often illegal or definitely unethical. I'm sorry you didn't see this. Good thing. So this is my slide that I was talking from.
Sorry, I just thought you were taking a break from your slide, but
Okay.
You're very articulate.
Now you see it. And so then we can also switch. Just think about the targeted elimination of Native peoples, right, of their bodies through these massacres, through frontier violence that starts in the 1600s, goes until the 1900s, but we can also think of kind of modern iterations of police brutality, of Indigenous people really having the highest rates of police brutality against our people. If we think of Standing Rock and all of those examples of protests and the way that Indigenous people then are met with violence as a continuation of that into the present. This is just a quote from John Milton Chivington, who was part of the Sand Creek Massacre. Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill the Indians and believe it's right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians, kill and scalp all, little, big, nits, make lice. So the really important piece for that is that nits in this, right, is children. And so thinking about the ways that children were not seen as children, they were just seen also as problems that needed to be eliminated. So we can look at the countless massacres. We can look at the sale that California State's wealth is really based on this sale for Indian scalps, diseases, and then also not just kind of, oh, these Europeans brought over these diseases on accident, all these people died, but really creating these terrible conditions on reservations so that if they did get a disease, it was instantly going to kind of, there was no way of them surviving because they induced these really unhealthy conditions on reservations, or if they tried to leave, then they would be killed as a result of that as well. So we want to think of the impact of that bodily violence and, the violence today of like looking at statistics of how many Native people are in your district, how many Native people live where you are, how many Native people are included in statistics. We're not statistically significant enough because as a direct result, right, of this violence. And so that's an extra kind of reinscribing of the violence. It's not, there just so happen to not be Native people here, but those are direct results of different massacres and removals. And you do get a shift of tactics again, continuing that logic of elimination, but changing a little bit from outright violence, the massacres, to assimilation. Once the US was considered settled, kind of making it all the way to California, the federal government's focus moved from physically eliminating Native people to assimilating them into Western society. And it's often argued that this was not done out of benevolence. They didn't have this wonderful epiphany that, hey, maybe we should stop killing these people, but it was actually the cheaper option to put folks in boarding schools to make these treaties with them, to kind of pacify them in alternative ways instead of fighting wars, which was much more expensive. And just a definition of assimilate, to make similar or incorporate into a larger body. So to kind of force people to be in this larger settler colonial politic. And you can see this kind of quintessential photo of the change of appearance, right? That we couldn't even continue to exist in the way that we appear, our hair, our dress, all of these different things needed to be changed and assimilated into the settler colonial state and norms of what people, what is civilized. As well as targeted elimination of Native modes of governance. And that's something that's really not talked about, that we all had. There were thousands of different types of governance systems that existed that were then targeted for elimination over time, right? And so even in a lot of treaty making processes, the actual leaders of that community weren't necessarily consulted. They would just kind of find someone and say, sign this, okay, great, we made this agreement with your nation. And so really upsetting those traditional governance systems. The Dawes Act, which is related to allotment, and saying, actually, no, you know what, you can't be these collective societies anymore. You each, you have to become farmers. We're going to give you these little plots of land and you're going to become a farmer and you're going to become civilized through doing this. The Indian Reorganization Act was supposed to be kind of giving this sovereignty back to Native people and giving them the right to self-governance, but was given in a way that was not to kind of honor or bring back the traditional governance systems, but really just given this kind of cookie cutter American system of government. And so that's what a lot of tribes continue to have today. And then termination, again, because as we move forward, like, this isn't enough, we need more and more and more. Termination was enacted on certain tribes as well to completely disband the sovereignty of tribes altogether. And some folks were able to kind of get their termination status reversed, but others weren't. And so they were offered these buyouts, which again, conditions are so bad, of course, you're gonna wanna take that. And so there's never really, it's always this kind of imbalance of power, and there's never any real option, and yet we're still here. And so highlighting that resilience as well. And targeting the elimination of Native ways of living, and that means everything, right? Language, our philosophies, our health. And so there's these different modes of assimilation, and they change throughout time. There are boarding schools, government-run boarding schools, and even before that, there are kind of religious-run boarding schools back to the 1600s that are kill the Indian, save the man. We're gonna take away everything that makes you who you are, that makes you of this particular indigenous nation, how you dress, how you talk, how you walk, what you eat. This is always a random thing that I throw in, but it's, I think, a detail that's not really thought of. Children, you know, I'm super lactose intolerant. A lot of Native people are lactose intolerant. And so to force children to drink milk every day must have just been so terrible. And, you know, just thinking about the everydayness of that targeting for elimination on these children's bodies is really detrimental, and has been to not just the individuals that went to these schools, and a lot of people did have mixed experiences there, but also to the broader transmission of cultural knowledge through time, and then relocation as being a piece of that, again, which I mentioned, and non-Native control of resources. Again, something that's not really thought about, that our waters, you know, we don't completely control our rivers. We don't completely control all of what would be our traditional territories and our lumber and things that are sold. We can think of pipelines. And more specifically to this talk, we can think of the fact that, you know, in Hoopa, right, it's the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation, but it's a California public school. So we have these outside agencies still kind of controlling the resources, how they're distributed. Yes, they're supposed to be in consultation. Doesn't necessarily happen all the time, and doesn't necessarily happen in the ways that it should. And so that outside control is also a continuation of this kind of settler colonial logic. And I wanted to highlight this example. This is from a Hoopa elder that's passed, Winnie George, and who talked about the boarding school as Honta Chua Will, the house it gets dark, also translated as a jail. And so she would talk about to her grandchildren and other kind of interviews about if you spoke Hoopa, then they would throw you in a jail. They had this kind of basement that they called the jail, and they would throw you down there if you spoke the Hoopa language. But it's fitting as well, kind of moving forward, if you think about like the school to prison pipeline, and just kind of the continued regimented ways that schools are like forcing control over these children's bodies, still continuing to devalue Native languages. We can really bring that metaphor out until the present. And the school also being structured, right? That the boarding school was an event, but settler colonialism is a structure. And so how is the school also structured through settler colonialism? And the second half of this will be, how do we then start to actively work against that? So I have some quotes from some scholars, just kind of making these connections from boarding schools to present day public schools in the logics around them. So Malathi Michelle Iyengar, sorry, that's a typo, Iyengar, is a professor in ethnic studies. And so this is from one of her articles. To kill the Indian nation, this exhalation had to be prevented, suffocated. But that act of suffocation of language could not actually take place upon the nation to eliminate indigenous nations, as a nation is an abstract concept, and as such cannot be literally suffocated. That act of suffocation of language, nation, had to be enacted upon the bodies of individual children. And these children aren't, 200 years ago. These children are my grandparents, some of your grandparents, some of your parents even. This is something that's very not far removed at all. And so we can talk about settler colonialism in the abstract, but I really want us to think about the individual implications of what happens to each child. And then what does that mean, kind of passing things down through generations. So I think we should have time, at least for part of this video. I wanted to at least show this. So this is Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart, who is really one of the people that kind of coined the term intergenerational historical trauma. And I want to start it in the middle. I'm going to stop sharing really quickly. Let's see. So it's a longer interview, but I wanted to start towards the end because this is when she starts to talk about her work. And she's talking about her dissertation that she was doing at Smith.
What sort of piqued your interest in starting to do historical trauma work?
Back in the 70s, I just remembered that was when I was at Columbia. I was just finishing school there and checking into the psychoanalytic training institutes there to get started. And I was looking at, it was just one day that I sat and was looking at some historical photographs in my apartment, and I just started sobbing, and I just got the sense of overwhelming grief, and it felt like it was huge, like it wasn't my personal grief, that it was something that was generational. And so I paid attention to that I felt like I was carrying this grief and this trauma of our ancestors. And so then after that, I started to just pay attention to that. And then at the Psychoanalytic Training Institute, I met a child of Holocaust survivors. And that's also when Helen Epstein's book came out. That was around 1976, Children of the Holocaust, which was really a qualitative study of the experiences of children of the Holocaust. And I started hearing more about that, and that just really resonated for me. And I thought about the American Indian Holocaust in a sense, and started developing more and more kind of allies. And I just remember my training analyst just happened to be Jewish. And one time I was talking about something, and he got it because he said, and because it was something personal and Native specific, and he said, "That's genocide." And I was like, yes, thank you for, he acknowledged it.
Absolutely. And
he got it.
Yes.
Yeah, and I felt like he understood. He understood, and so that was really encouraging too.
Very powerful.
Yeah, so I felt like I could keep on this, that I was onto something that could help our people. So I started integrating it in, working in clinical practice and kind of taking that lens, and then also in presentations I was doing and group groups I was running, and
absolutely,
and just developing it and building that, and
right.
Workshops.
Something that runs through your narrative a lot is your ability to really reflect on your internal process.
Mm-hmm.
And your dreams are really important to you as well. I know. And you shared some of those that helped inform.
Yeah, I had a dream as a child that later, as an adult, was interpreted by one of our healers, and it was a dream about an elephant. That in my dream, the elephant had escaped from a circus, and I think I was probably about 6 years old, and it was like dark and raining, and all of a sudden this elephant is like running, and I'm like, wide-eyed, just standing there like, what do I do? And what I do in the dream is I just put my arms out, like to welcome that elephant, and then the elephant jumps into my arms, but then turns into like a little kitten. And when I was telling that dream to the healer, he said that was about kind of embracing the real ancient ways and the ancient traditions. And because I had another dream later about an elephant who was drowning, and a whole group of us, and this dream was 1992. And then all of us that had been involved with the first historical trauma and unresolved grief intervention, the work, which is what's my dissertation work, we were all, and all of us are involved in traditional ceremonies. So we were all standing around that elephant, and we were going to that elephant to pray for that elephant. And that was, again, so those were really connected with what I was told. So
yeah, wow, it's really powerful.
Yeah,
I think really, really powerful. So so that's what also you were referring to as the Takini Network, I believe. Is that right? The training that you did with those facilitators.
Yeah. So in 1992. Which is when I did the actual dissertation workshop, we had two things. One was the training of the trainers to prepare for delivering it to a larger group, and then followed up within a few weeks by the full intervention with 45. That was the 45 people involved. And so what I did was I recruited all my friends and relatives to join me in, because we trained co-facilitators. So each group had a male and a female co-facilitator.
Nice.
But also in that sort of psychoanalytic vein that, which I really think is important, is that if you're going to do clinical work with people, you need to do your own work. So the concept of self-analysis, training analysis is really important, because otherwise your stuff can get in the way, and that's not fair to the people you're working with.
Absolutely.
So the model was that we would go through our own training, healing experience before we would deliver that. So we would go through what we were asking the people to do.
Absolutely. Nice.
And so I had... So that's when we formed the Takini Network. And the idea was to have, to almost form an extended family kinship network, and to devote to working on this and working on that healing. So those were the original trainers that were trained, that I recruited, and a couple were clinical providers, native, mostly all native folks, and some were traditional healers, and some were Bigfoot memorial riders, and just people who were already doing a lot of their own healing work and just very committed. So those became our core group.
Nice. Well, now, sort of, do you think that you want to say any more just about your definition for historical trauma before we fast forward to what you're doing now?
Yes, I define it as cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across generations, including one's own lifespan, because everything up to a minute ago is history.
Yes.
So so some people misunderstand it and think that I'm only talking about the distant past, and I'm
Absolutely.
not. I'm talking about everything up to the present.
Yes.
And including the present reality, which just happened a minute ago. So
right.
I'll end there, and the video will be in the slides, and I'm going to share those later, so you can definitely take a look at that when we'll go through those slides later. And I'm going to speed up a little bit because I know I want to leave time for us to have questions. And you can see this, right? You can see my slides again.
Yes.
Take you quickly through understanding how settler colonialism targets children, and then we'll get into some of the other side of that. How do you foster resilience, and what are some strategies for kind of having this anti-colonial literacy? So Leanne Simpson, who is Anishinaabe, says Indigenous bodies, particularly the bodies of Two-Spirit, queer people, children, and women, represented the lived alternatives to heteronormative constructions of gender, political systems, and rules of descent. They represent alternative Indigenous political systems that refuse to replicate capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and whiteness. This is why the bodies of children and the structure of our families were attacked through the residential and day school systems, and continue to be targeted through the state's child welfare system and state-run education system. So again, you can see that logic continuing to target Indigenous children, as they really do represent the future of Indigenous nations. Another Indigenous scholar, Sandy Grande, says with regard to American Indians, this means understanding the Indian problem is not a problem of children and families, but rather first and foremost a problem that has been consciously and historically produced by and through systems of colonialism. So really reframing children as the problem, Indigenous children as the problem, to actually it's these structures and people that are replicating these structures. Kanaka Maoli scholar Noelani Goodyear Kaopua says settler colonialisms are historically rooted, land-centered projects that are never fully complete, thus requiring constant effort to marginalize and extinguish Indigenous connection so as to secure control of land. The public school system functions to naturalize these relations of power. Again, so, you didn't learn about settler colonialism in school because it serves to kind of reinforce itself through the erasure of Indigenous history and knowledge. So these are some common examples of colonialism that continue to exist in classrooms: anti-Indigenous racism and erasure in curriculum, stereotypes used in curriculum and by teachers and other students, speaking of Indigenous peoples only in the past tense, celebrating people that enacted violence against Indigenous peoples. You can think of Columbus, racist Thanksgiving and Halloween activities, placing emphasis on colonial knowledge and standards over Indigenous languages and knowledge. And this is a little less overt, but always prioritizing standardized tests that are done in English, then always kind of leaves Indigenous language and knowledge at the bottom. And so that might be kind of an unintentional replication, so being aware of that. High rates of punishment of Indigenous students as well. And this is one of our prizes, but just thinking also through resilience, resistance, and survivance, that despite genocide, relocation, colonial education, and this is specifically thinking about the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation community, but this is, I think, can be true of lots of Indigenous communities, sustaining our ways of knowing and understanding, our relationships to human, natural, and spiritual realms, and our methods of transferring knowledge, despite all of these attempts to get us to stop doing those things. Just some other examples of current political movements and resistance against that. I always like to highlight this quote from Jimmy Jackson, who was an elder that passed away, who went to boarding school in Riverside. I was away at school where they were teaching us English. They didn't want us to speak the Indian language because they said Indian language is wrong, and they scared us off. Everybody was afraid to say something in their language. If they had just kept out of it and let us speak the language in school, everyone would know it today. They took it from us. Now we have to try to get it back. I'm going to fast forward a little bit through some of these slides. But survivance just really being the recognition of our continued survival. And so yes, it's resilience, but it's a specific type of resilience against colonialism in spite of all of these barriers to, you know, the state wanting our death. We continue to exist and survive and really thrive in lots of ways. So it is more than just survival. So how do we foster supportive environments for Indigenous students? Positive relationships really are the antidote to toxic stress. If you have these positive relationships over a prolonged amount of time, then it really can start to buffer some of those negative effects of toxic stress. And we can do a couple things, help regulate the child's kind of learned responses to toxic stress, relate and connect with the child through attuned, sensitive relationships. And third, we can support the child to reflect, learn, remember, articulate, and become self-assured. And so again, like introducing these concepts, this is why you're acting in this way. So what can we do to kind of act in other ways? So this is just a general definition of resilience, capacity of individuals, families, communities to heal from trauma, to strengthen their well-being and adaptability in ways that can mitigate and prevent future trauma. And so this is just general resilience, right? But we, again, want to think of the specific context of Indigenous students and their families. The most significant factor in the development of resilience is relationships with caring adults. So that's really important, but we want to think about specific types of care, because sometimes things like the boarding school were good intentioned people wanting to, you know, help Native children. And so we really want to also be critical of that stance of helping. Maybe it isn't helping, but maybe it is just creating these reciprocal relationships to support and learn from one another. And so this goes to a question that someone asked: how do we start to reverse these things? And so we have risk factors versus protective factors, and you can see that protective factors really do outweigh the impact of certain risk factors. So if we have an overwhelming amount of protective factors, then that really will end up in a kind of positive result. And so this is how we can move through those connections. If you have caring relationships, high expectations, and participation, that can then lead to positive development in your brain, as a person, your body, your systems can change, and then leads to these successful outcomes individually, healthy families, healthy communities, and learning to be responsive. So these are some definitions of resilience factors. Caring relationships include social connections, concrete support in times of need, high expectations and ability to participate, social and emotional competence of children, having high expectations but not too high, having them be developmentally appropriate, self-efficacy, parental resilience, and knowledge of parenting and child development is important to understanding why you support certain things in certain ways, and being very intentional about that. And research on resilience tells us that connection is key. And so we saw all the negative impacts of neglect and not having that connection. Well, the answer then is connection. So here are some strategies, and I'll move through these and then we can get into some questions. To working with students, teach emotional language, model emotional language. So not just, you know, saying you should do these things, but really modeling those behaviors, model problem solving, repair when you flip your lid. So we can think back to the video with the hand. Check in with your expectations. So this is kind of people, you know, educators checking in with themselves. That's what I really appreciated about the video about historical trauma is we can't really do this work with other people if we haven't done that work on ourselves. We're not constantly thinking of, you know, what are the things that I need to do or change. Prevent lid flipping. What are the things we need to do to prevent that, our emotions from overtaking us? reviewing and retelling the story of the day, and remembering that social skills need to be taught, modeled. Rules and expectations are different in different environments. So even though you might have this really structured classroom, the environment at home might not be as structured. And so you need to kind of be able to adapt to those things and be aware of those things. So we can look at positive interactions, safe relationships, relevant both to, I think, development, but as well as their lives. Things need to be relevant to who they are and their local environments. Repetitive, having those patterns and reinforcement. Rewarding, it should be something that is good and fun and satisfying. Rhythmic, so they know what are the patterns to expect. And being respectful of the child, the family, the community, and the culture. And that could be lots of cultures within your classroom. But I want to also, which time do we have? A couple minutes. Think about, again, what is the specific ways that, what is the specificity of Indigenous resilience in the face of colonial trauma, in the face of all of these institutions that are continue to be against Native children and their families. It's a collective thing. And so resilience can be like, okay, I'm going to do these 5 things for this individual child, but actually we want to think more broadly. What are the structural things that I need to do to make it so that Indigenous children aren't having to be resilient, but can actually survive and thrive in these environments? And so how can I start to combat some of those barriers? And so, and I'll put the book in the chat afterwards. Let's see if you can see this really quickly after I put it in the chat. Can you see this? So this is Indigenous Children's Survivance in Public Schools. Highly recommend this book. I will put it in the chat so you can look that up. This is where some of the framing comes on this. So she talks about developing an anti-colonial literacy to support Indigenous students. And so she says, and this is both her and me, things that we can do as educators to support Indigenous students researching and forming meaningful relationships with local tribes, taking that responsibility to do those things. If you haven't, it's not going to be the baseline. That's not something you're necessarily going to learn in your teaching credential program. That's not necessarily something that's going to happen in your orientation. So you do have to take that initiative. Questioning the given curriculum around Indigenous peoples, empowering students to share their knowledge without objectifying them. So definitely encouraging them to share things about themselves, but not looking to them for the Indigenous perspective on, millions of Indigenous people. Create meaningful relationships with families, bring in local tribal experts. I think sometimes people are like, well, like I can't do this whole unit on traditional basket weaving because I'm non-native. Well, nobody's asking you to do that. Actually, there are lots of people that you can bring in to bring and value that expert knowledge. It's really impactful for children to see, their auntie come in the classroom and share their expert knowledge with their class. Integrate Indigenous curriculum and resources in your classroom beyond, California Indian Day or Native American Heritage Month, but make it a regular practice. Prioritize opportunities for Indigenous language and knowledge. Again, sometimes it's really easy to just say, well, I have these standards, I have all these other things to do. Language is kind of the last thing on my brain. Being intentional about questioning that and saying, actually, we need to make sure that we're making time for language, or, sending your kids to Indigenous language classes if that's an option. Understanding and highlighting the diversity of Indigenous peoples, not just one sentence about all Indigenous people, but there are lots of different tribes with lots of differences in languages and who they are. Always speak and teach of Indigenous peoples in the present. We are here, we are alive. Make people know that. Read Indigenous education scholars, and so I've introduced you to some of them and can definitely follow up with some more resources later. Recognize the broader context Indigenous students bring with them in the classroom. So thinking about that history that I brought you through and that intergenerational trauma as well as survivance that they bring with them into the classroom. Let students tell you what they need, not assuming that you can make that judgment call for them. Create a classroom in which students can see themselves reflected in curriculum and stories in all aspects. Challenge instances of anti-Indigenous racism and erasure in your schools. So this is a little bit outside of your classroom. You know, if there are other teachers that are doing something, if there's something in an assembly that's really problematic, step up and say, hey, actually, we shouldn't do this. Challenge overzealous punishment of Indigenous students. If you look at your statistics, I can almost guarantee you Indigenous students are one of the top groups that are getting expelled and suspended and all these things. And so question why that's happening. And understanding that this work won't be easy. This is one training. You don't know it all now. I don't know it all now. That this is an ongoing process that is going to be hard and is going to be uncomfortable at times, but it's definitely worth it to supporting students more wholly, instead of just these, you know, small activities that we can do that might help them for the day, but really making this lasting change in the classroom. So how much time do we have? 5 minutes? No, we have 2 minutes.
So much. I'm so glad your voice held up that long. That's really a lot of stamina. And thank you. I mean, if we were all together, I'd be clapping. Thank you so much. And I want to just express everybody's patience and being forgiving. This is only the second one I've ever done. So I'm also just learning as I go. And Sarah, she did an excellent job. And Jen Mager, thank you. So I wanted to look at the chat box and get to people, but first I wanted to ask the 2 co-presenters if you wouldn't mind staying on a little longer. And for those of you that are interested in talk, and then mute yourself if you can, and then I'll get to your questions. But I'm willing to stay on a little bit longer, and hopefully Sarah and Jen can, but if they can't, then I understand. So I'm going to go to the chat box, but please do fill out the survey. If you have to leave and take off right away, do the survey. It's very important for us to continue to be able to provide these and to make them better. And the 3 of us had already discussed having more in the very near future to get more into the last part, which I know everybody was super hungry for, which is the resilience and what can we do on the ground as advocates and teachers and educators. So there was a really good question in the chat box. Go in that order. You could also mute yourself, Sherry, and then we'll get to your question. If you can mute just for a moment. I'm going to go in the order that the questions were posted in the box here. Question about the age that you can present genocide. And the question was, I want to teach it. I'm a 3rd and 4th grade teacher, but how do I present, you know, that type of genocide? When is the right appropriate time? So maybe Sarah, you could give us some tips on that.
Yeah, for sure. I often get that because that's usually the first question. When do you teach about racism? When do you teach about colonialism? And I think that question in itself is a privilege because most of us do grow up with these stories from the early age of, you know, when I was 5, when I was your age, you know, I was taken away to a boarding school. My grandma was taken away when she was 5. And so that question itself is a privilege, but I think to answer that, I really think there are lots of ways that you can talk about things from, you know, kindergarten or preschool. I talk to my 5-year-olds about boarding schools when I do language camps. And I don't, you know, mention everything, but there are lots of children's books and ways to talk about things that get them to understand kind of the importance and what's at stake. And so there are lots of resources definitely out there about that, and I think I don't really think that there's an age that's too young to start talking about it, because a lot of us do, you know, it's our lived realities.
Okay, thank you. Yes,
that's what I was going to say. Sorry to interrupt, Jane, but I just have to speak up to that because it is never too early, and it's very important that it's just taught as common knowledge, and it can be done carefully, and so it's not too brutal, but to be honest and instill that knowledge and share that knowledge. I teach first grade, and I teach it from here already. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you for coming, Carlotta, and for sharing. And I wanted to just highlight real quick what Keisha Lara teaches. And she wrote an article about this, that erasure and leaving out and omissions of Indigenous history, culture, and value is violent. It's a violent act for the children at school, and it turns into microaggressions, which build up over time. And those are little discriminations that students experience, where they get turned off from school early, or they get into a conflict with their teacher, or they're embarrassed by something that they're portrayed as negatively. So it's really, I think, important to uplift and to incorporate into every subject. It's possible to talk about the values and the contributions to uplift Indigenous students so that they don't have low self-esteem and that turns into bad behaviors. So any other pressing questions? I did search through the chat box and I didn't really see any more, but if you have one now, please ask.
Hi, I did have a question about one of the last slides. I forget the point on it. If it's possible to bring back up, is that doable at all? If not, it's absolutely okay.
Yeah, I think I can do that.
Thank you so much. It was the second to last slide. There was something that I wasn't sure about and I wanted a little bit of elaboration on it. It was recognize the broader context of Indigenous students that Indigenous students bring with them into the classroom. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Because I was having a hard time conceptualizing it.
Yeah, I was just thinking through, right, that history that we went through, that's something that
yes.
bring with them. We heard the discussion around intergenerational trauma, that it's something that's inherited and that, you know, like really impacts who they are. Like I said, my grandparents went to boarding school. And so as a result of that, my dad doesn't speak Hoopa language. So as a result of that, I don't speak Hoopa language. And I bring that with me into a classroom, right? That all of these legacies of, you know, who they are and the experiences that they've had or not, or where they live, were they adopted, were they in foster care, were they taken away, were they a result of relocation, like all of these disconnections are a result of this broader legacy. And so, yeah, they're this individual student, but they bring all of this history with them into the classroom as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. That seems like a very important thing to be mindful of. And also, like, I obviously have a lot to learn about Native history, so I'll try to do my best part in educating myself so I can provide that for students. Thank you.
Sarah, can I make a point on that?
Yes.
Thank you for asking that question. And unfortunately, there's a lot of us that are Indigenous that don't look at Indigenous, and people just assume we're not. And the exact same history as Sarah. My grandfather was put into a reform school, as you call it, or anyway, the point is that thank you for recognizing that, understanding that we have a lot of education to the American public about what's happened to our cultural society as Native Americans.
I think in the classroom, we can definitely expand not just on Indigenous people, but Indigenous peoples seeing that we are a part of a collective of experiences. We're not the only people who experience those things. In fact, I didn't experience it. My ancestors did. But you can also check in with other kids from other cultures whose families experience the same thing, because we're a melting pot of people. You know, Mexicans experience the same thing. Asians experience the same type of thing. Jewish people experience the same type of thing. And again, it's not us who experienced it, but it's our ancestors who experienced it. So I think that when we identify and say that this has happened to Indigenous people, we can say, who else knows about their culture and this sort of thing happening. And that way it's not just about Indigenous people, it's about people as a whole and the atrocities that have happened within many cultures, and that we are all similar to each other and a part of the human race, not just a divisive, not just a divide of different cultures, but a sharing of experiences.
I couldn't agree more. We are one.
I have a comment to make on that. As a Hispanic woman, I realize that I'm a minoritized person, but I also recognize that Indigenous people are far more marginalized than myself. So I think sometimes you need to take the time to have that extra focus on them. It's not so much as creating a divide, but just recognizing that their history and their culture is important and they are being erased as we speak. And I just feel that I loved this presentation. It was great. It was informative. And I'm all with you, T. Weaver, about like we've all experienced this as a whole in our own different ways, but I think we also need to take a second to recognize how much more impactful it has been to this particular group that is being erased so much so that they are not even significantly statistically significant in what we do in the schools. They are not being recognized, and I think that's the point that we need to remember when it comes to presentations like this.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I would add that if you think back to the slide where I talked about the different kind of intersecting structures of power to settler colonialism, that white supremacy is a part of that. And so yes, we all have cultures, but we all kind of minoritized groups are also affected by white supremacy in very different ways. And so having those conversations, not just about, you know, we eat these foods and, oh, we eat these foods, that's great. But what are the ways also that we can kind of band together to work against racial injustice? Because it does pit us against one another in a lot of ways. It silos people, it asks people to rank, well, my struggle's worse than your struggle. But that's something that I really appreciate about this framework of settler colonialism, is that it then shows you, okay, kind of oppression here starts with Indigenous people, and then you have Black people very soon after being brought over as slaves, and then you have, you know, oppression against, you know, Mexican people through Spanish colonization, and then you have Asian people being forced to work in certain way, you know, indentured servitude, like all of these things kind of work on top of one another. So I do definitely think that there's a place for that comparative lens and definitely some power in doing this work of kind of anti-racism, anti-colonialism together.
Thank you, everybody, for all your thoughtful comments. I did want to acknowledge Maggie Peters had a question in the box about, or a comment about, often it is hard to get cultural bearers and experts to come in the classroom. And I've been told that also by teachers. They want to, they really are looking, but the few people that do those kinds of volunteer work, you know, they're artists and they're grandmas and grandpas and they're busy and they don't have a lot of time to go into all the schools and do this. So it's definitely an area that we need to work on, I think, and recruit people. And now that we're in the virtual environment, it's a lot easier to have access to that because we can share videos of previous workshops. So I hope that teachers are looking for those. And before everyone gets off, I wanted to put the link to the survey and to encourage you to do that. And if you signed up, if you were one of the first 20 to sign up for a book, you'll get that in the mail. And we definitely want to do another one, I believe, at least I do. And after I talk with my colleagues, we'll see when we can present another one. And then NCIDC.org has a Indigenous Education Advocacy link. And we're compiling K through 12 curriculum there for teachers to borrow and use, and other resources. So it's a work in progress. There's not much there yet, but that's one of the major projects we're working on. So I really appreciate everyone being here tonight and sharing in community and in the spirit of healing, and for all of the hard work that our teachers are doing. They're superheroes right now. It's very difficult times, and I know teachers have families at home and they're trying to get their own children to do their homework. and doing everything else on top of it. So I appreciate all of you spending this long 2.5 hours with us. And we will follow up with the PDF of the slides by email and make announcements about our other upcoming webinars. And thank you to First Five for sponsoring, and for Dr. Sarah Chase for her long-winded ability to, to keep going. I hope you drink some tea afterwards. So thanks everyone, and I'm gonna save the chat box and you can email myself. Do you wanna pull up your resource page? Does it have a contacts list?
Let me, I don't, but let me put it at the end of the slides before we send it out.
Okay.
Does that work?
Yes, and then I have everybody's contact information as well, and feel free to email me with follow-up information. And thanks again for coming, and good night.
Night.
Thank you. Good night.
Well.
She left too. Hey, Sunshine.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. This is a great training. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Sarah. That was a lot of really great information. A lot to process. A lot to process. Yeah, but it was really great. So I appreciate you guys and have a great evening.
Yeah.
Hey.
Get off here.
I thought Rain was gonna stay, but I guess not, so we'll jump off.
I did too.
Yeah, it was her idea.
Maybe she meant for the Q&A.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.